I stood frozen in my driveway, the acrid smell of gasoline filling my nostrils as flames engulfed my Ford sedan. The flickering orange light illuminated the smug face of Margaret Holloway, the president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, HOA. She stood with her arms crossed, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "Next time, you'll think twice about refusing to join," she sneered, her voice dripping with malice. Margaret had no idea who she was dealing with. She had just committed arson against a man who had spent 23 years prosecuting organized crime in Chicago. I had seen it all: corruption, intimidation, and violence, but I never expected to encounter it in the quiet, manicured streets of Oak Ridge Estates. After decades of chasing mob bosses and dismantling crime syndicates, I had retired to Oak Ridge Estates seeking peace and quiet. The neighborhood seemed perfect: pristine houses, manicured lawns, and the promise of suburban tranquility. Moving day went smoothly, and a few neighbors even brought welcome baskets. But it wasn't long before I noticed her, Margaret Holloway, clipboard in hand, watching me from across the street like a hawk. The next morning, at 7 a.m., my doorbell rang. There she stood, her pearl necklace gleaming against her crisp blazer. "Welcome to Oak Ridge," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "I'm the president of the HOA. I brought your membership papers." I reviewed the documents, 47 pages of restrictions, regulations, and monthly dues that seemed astronomical for what they provided. "I appreciate the offer," I said, handing back the papers, "but I'll pass." Her smile vanished. "Everyone joins the HOA, Mr. Carter. It's practically mandatory." "Practically isn't the same as legally required," I replied. Something darkened behind her eyes. "You don't understand. The HOA protects everyone's interests here." "I'm sure it does," I said, "but I'll manage my property my own way, thank you." Her composure cracked slightly. "That's unfortunate. Residents who don't participate often find Oak Ridge less accommodating." The threat wasn't subtle. I'd heard similar tones from mob enforcers. "Is that a warning, Ms. Holloway?" "Simply an observation," she said, turning to leave. Then she paused. "Oh, and your mailbox is 3 inches taller than regulations permit. You'll want to fix that." My mailbox was identical to others on the street. This wasn't about compliance, it was about control. That night, I found the first note on my windshield: "Conform or leave." The next morning, neighbors who had welcomed me suddenly avoided eye contact. I had spent my career recognizing patterns of intimidation, and the tactics were familiar, just with a suburban veneer. What Margaret didn't realize was that she wasn't dealing with an ordinary homeowner. She was using a crime family's playbook against someone who had written the manual on taking them down. 3 weeks into my standoff with the HOA, the psychological warfare intensified. Each day brought new confrontations. Neighbors at my door with rehearsed speeches about community standards and property values. One afternoon, Bill Henderson from 2 doors down appeared on my porch. "Look, I'm just trying to help," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Before you, there were the Thompsons. They didn't join either. Their kids' bikes kept getting vandalized. Then their dog mysteriously got sick. They moved within 3 months." I recognized the technique: fear wrapped in neighborly concern. Instead of showing anger, I invited him in for coffee. "You seem worried, Bill," I said, activating the recording app on my phone discreetly. "How long have you lived in Oak Ridge?" 7 years, he replied, fidgeting with his coffee mug. "Margaret runs a tight ship. Things work smoothly when everyone follows the rules." I nodded sympathetically. "And what happens when they don't?" His eyes darted to the window. "Problems happen. Car trouble, permit issues, social isolation." "Sounds organized," I said. "Almost like a system." "Look," he lowered his voice, "Margaret has connections at City Hall. She can make life difficult. Just last year, the Millers questioned assessment fees. Next thing, they had building inspectors finding code violations that never existed before. And everyone just accepts this?" I asked. "What choice is there?" he sighed. "Margaret keeps files on everyone. She knows which buttons to push." I leaned forward. "How many other families has she pushed out, Bill?" "At least 6 that I know of," he admitted. His admission hung in the air. "Oh God, I shouldn't have said that." "Actually, Bill," I said, revealing my phone, "I think you said exactly what needed to be said." His face drained of color. "She'll know I talked." "No, she won't," I assured him. Because you're now protected by something more powerful than Margaret, evidence in a federal investigation. His eyes widened. Federal? Who are you? I smiled. Just a new neighbor who knows exactly how to handle organized intimidation. As Bill left, visibly shaken, I felt a familiar satisfaction. The first piece of evidence was secure. The HOA didn't realize they weren't terrorizing a helpless homeowner. They were providing case materials against themselves. The discovery that Margaret had systematically forced out 6 families gave me a clear direction. This wasn't just petty neighborhood tyranny, it had all the markers of a racketeering operation. I decided to apply the same methodical approach I had used against crime syndicates. My first step was surveillance. I installed cameras covering my property, visible ones as a deterrent, hidden ones to gather evidence. It paid off immediately. At 3:17 a.m., my phone alerted me to movement in the front yard. On the screen, there was Margaret, her business suit exchanged for black clothing, measuring my grass with a ruler and photographing my mailbox. Rather than confronting her, I documented the trespass and began building my case file. Next came counterintelligence. Each morning, I walked the neighborhood before dawn, photographing similar violations at board members' homes, Jim Baker's fence that exceeded height restrictions, Treasurer Helen Porter's unapproved garden gnomes, Margaret's own non-regulation porch lights. The hypocrisy was blatant and now documented. I leveraged my federal contacts quietly. My former colleague at the FBI ran background checks that revealed Margaret's sealed embezzlement conviction from her previous homeowners association in Florida. Helen had an insurance fraud case settled out of court. 3 other board members had financial irregularities in their histories. This wasn't random. Margaret had assembled a team with specific skills and vulnerabilities she could control. The pattern became clear when I followed the HOA's maintenance worker to a storage unit rented under Margaret's maiden name. While he was inside, I placed a small tracking device on his vehicle, a technique I'd used countless times on syndicate couriers. The next day, I arrived at the storage facility with a warrant obtained through a judge who owed me a favor. Inside were meticulously organized files on every resident who had ever questioned Margaret's authority, financial information, personal photographs, and detailed pressure strategies tailored to each family's vulnerabilities. Most disturbing was a section labeled Elimination Successes, containing documentation of the 6 families who'd been forced out, including recordings of their distress and photos of their moving trucks that could only have been taken by someone celebrating their departure. The operation was sophisticated. HOA dues weren't just padding Margaret's lifestyle. They funded a network of contractors, city officials, and even 2 local police officers who would respond to nuisance calls against targeted residents. Bank records showed thousands funneled through shell companies for neighborhood improvements that never materialized. Each discovery connected to another. Margaret hadn't just created a corrupt HOA. She'd established a perfect microcosm of organized crime, hidden behind suburban respectability. The turning point came when I intercepted communications between board members discussing their special assessment fund, a slush fund used to pay their enforcement network. In one email, Margaret explicitly instructed Jim to arrange for my water service to be disrupted as a first-level warning. I recognized the pattern immediately. It was identical to how crime families escalated pressure on businesses that wouldn't pay protection money, start with inconveniences, escalate to property damage, and finally move to violence. Margaret was following the same playbook, but against someone who had spent decades learning to dismantle it. Margaret's campaign against me entered a new phase with precision that would have impressed even the most ruthless crime bosses. My water mysteriously shut off mid-shower. My mail arrived mangled or went missing entirely. 3 times, I found dead birds arranged on my welcome mat. Amateur intimidation, but effective in its message. The social isolation cut deeper than the practical inconveniences. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid me. Children were hurried away when I walked past. Invitations to community events stopped arriving. I'd experienced similar tactics from mob families who turned neighborhoods against witnesses, but experiencing it firsthand revealed the true psychological toll. The HOA's monthly newsletter, printed on expensive glossy paper that surely consumed a significant portion of those inflated dues, began featuring a community concerns column that described an unnamed resident whose refusal to participate endangers our community standards. The article detailed suspicious activity at my address and hinted at potential criminal connections. The irony wasn't lost on me. One morning, I found my garbage cans overturned and contents scattered across my lawn, just as Margaret drove by with the code enforcement officer she kept in her pocket. The $250 citation arrived that afternoon. When I contested it with clear evidence of tampering, the appeal was denied without review. Classic racketeering: create the problem, then profit from the solution. Their mistake was assuming I was fighting alone. 20 years prosecuting organized crime had taught me to build networks of my own. I maintained contact with Bill Henderson through secure channels, gathering intelligence about upcoming HOA maneuvers. I documented every violation, building a case that grew stronger each day. The true turning point came when I discovered Alice Greenberg, an 83-year-old widow, crying on her porch. She clutched an HOA violation notice citing her unauthorized wind chimes and excessive bird feeders. The fine was $750, almost her entire monthly Social Security check. "They've never bothered me before," she sobbed. "But yesterday, I waved to you when you walked past. This morning, this was taped to my door." The vindictiveness infuriated me. "Alice, has Margaret pressured you before?" "Not until you moved in," she said. "Now she says I need to show community solidarity by avoiding disruptive elements." Alice wiped her eyes. "I've lived here 37 years. My Herald helped build the park they're so proud of. I made a decision. Alice, what if I told you we could stop Margaret permanently, but I need your help?" Her expression shifted from despair to determination. "That woman has bullied her last neighbor. What do you need?" I showed Alice my evidence file, the surveillance photos, financial records, and pattern of harassment. Her eyes widened. "She's been doing this for years. The Johnsons, the Patels, the Wilsons, all wonderful families who suddenly moved. I always wondered why." Alice became my most valuable ally. Her home, assumed to be safe by Margaret's crew, became our operational headquarters. Other neighbors carefully joined our resistance: the Mendez family, whose landscaping business lost contracts after they questioned assessment increases; Tom Franklin, whose disability accommodation requests were repeatedly denied; the Changs, who faced constant citations after refusing to remove their cultural garden ornaments. We created a shadow network within Oak Ridge, documenting abuses and building a comprehensive case. Small recording devices captured board members making threats. Hidden cameras recorded their enforcers vandalizing property. Most critically, we tracked the money, following every dollar from inflated dues to Margaret's network of corrupt officials. Margaret sensed the resistance forming but couldn't identify its source. Her tactics grew more desperate and more careless. As pressure increased, so did her mistakes. She didn't realize she wasn't fighting just one stubborn homeowner anymore. She was facing a coordinated operation led by someone who had dismantled organizations far more sophisticated than her suburban crime ring. The quarterly HOA meeting was mandatory for all residents, another of Margaret's control mechanisms. The community center buzzed with tension as I took a seat in the back row. Alice nodded discreetly from across the room. Our hidden recording devices activated. Margaret dominated the meeting with practiced authority, detailing new security measures that conveniently required a special assessment of $500 per household. Went the financial report showed a $500 per household. Went the financial report showed a $43,000 surplus. Margaret quickly glossed over it. My moment had arrived. "I'd like to ask about line item 6 on page 3, I said, standing. The room fell silent. "It shows $43,000 for administrative consulting, but there's no breakdown of these services." Margaret's smile tightened. "Those are standard operational expenses, Mr. Carter. If you joined the HOA, you'd receive the detailed reports." "Actually," I countered, "distributing copies of the relevant statute, public disclosure laws require financial transparency regardless of membership, especially concerning funds collected under color of authority." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Margaret's face flushed. "Are you accusing the board of something, Mr. Carter?" "I'm simply requesting information all homeowners are legally entitled to," I said. "Unless there's something in those expenses you'd prefer to keep hidden." Her composure cracked. "Some people seem determined to undermine the stability of our community," she hissed. "People who refuse to contribute yet demand privileges. People who clearly don't understand that some personal tragedies are entirely preventable. The threat hung in the air as she glared directly at me. "This meeting is adjourned," she snapped, gathering her papers while instructing board members to stay behind. At 3:07 a.m., the sound of breaking glass jolted me awake. From my bedroom window, I watched a figure approach my car in the driveway. Security lights illuminated Margaret's face as she poured liquid over the hood. The acrid smell of gasoline drifted through my open window. I activated the emergency recording protocol on all cameras and dialed 911 as Margaret struck a match. The whoosh of flames was immediate, hungry fire engulfing my sedan. I reported the arson in progress, specifically identifying Margaret Holloway as the perpetrator. Most revealing was Margaret's reaction. She didn't flee. Instead, she stepped back, crossed her arms, and watched the blaze with satisfaction. When neighbors emerged from their homes in panic, she calmly stated, "This is what happens to people who don't understand community standards." Her eyes met mine through the window. Rather than showing fear of being caught, she smiled, confident in her impunity, certain that her network of corrupt officials would protect her, as it always had. The fire department arrived quickly, followed by 2 police officers I recognized from Margaret's payroll. When I attempted to show them the surveillance footage, they insisted it needed to be processed through proper channels. I played the traumatized victim perfectly, appearing shocked and confused. Margaret provided a practiced alibi about being home asleep, while the officers nodded sympathetically. As they left, Margaret lingered behind, approaching me with a whisper. "Next time, it might not be just your car. Some accidents happen inside homes." She had no idea she just delivered the final piece of evidence I needed, on camera, with multiple witnesses, and to a federal prosecutor who just watched her commit felony arson. As dawn broke over the charred remains of my car, I made a crucial strategic decision. Rather than immediately revealing my profession, I maintained the facade of a frightened homeowner. The officers, clearly in Margaret's pocket, filed a report listing the cause as electrical malfunction, despite the overwhelming smell of gasoline still hanging in the air. "These things happen," one officer said with practiced indifference. "Maybe consider joining the HOA. They have excellent security protocols." I nodded meekly, playing my role. "I'll think about it." The moment they left, I activated the next phase of my operation. The surveillance footage, already secured on encrypted servers, was transmitted to Jessica Ramirez, my former deputy at the Chicago field office. Within an hour, she called back. "Holy hell, Mark," she exclaimed. "This is textbook racketeering, with bonus arson. We've got jurisdiction the second she used fire." "I need this done by the book," I instructed. "This woman has half the local authorities compromised." "Federal warrants, full tactical team, simultaneous execution." By noon, Judge Martinez, who still remembered how I protected his family during a cartel trial, had signed search warrants for 7 addresses, the homes of all board members, the HOA office, and Margaret's storage unit. At precisely 6 a.m. the next morning, synchronized raids hit all 7 locations. I deliberately stayed away, maintaining my cover, while the FBI's tactical teams executed flawlessly. Margaret was still in her bathrobe when agents breached her front door. Her expression of entitlement collapsed as they presented federal warrants. The evidence recovered exceeded even my expectations. Margaret's home office contained financial records detailing embezzlement from 3 different homeowners associations. Helen Porter's computer held spreadsheets tracking compliance and incentives, bribes to local officials. Jim Baker maintained detailed surveillance logs on problematic residents. Most damning was the discovery in Margaret's garage, gasoline-soaked clothing matching what she'd worn during the arson, hidden behind holiday decorations. The arrogance was staggering. She hadn't even bothered to dispose of the evidence. The storage unit yielded the operational manual of their enterprise, a binder Margaret titled Community Management Techniques that outlined escalating pressure tactics, from social isolation to property damage. It included profiles of every resident who had ever opposed her, complete with their vulnerabilities and pressure points. I waited until all evidence was secured before making my entrance. As FBI agents escorted Margaret from her home in handcuffs, I stepped from my unmarked federal vehicle, badge visible on my belt. Federal Prosecutor Mark Carter. I introduced myself formally. Organized Crime Division. The shock on Margaret's face was everything I'd hoped for. the dawning horror as she realized she targeted not just any homeowner, but someone with the exact expertise to dismantle her operation. "This is absurd," she sputtered. "I'm the victim here." This man refused to comply with community standards. Community standards don't typically include arson, extortion, mail fraud, and racketeering, I replied calmly. "But we've documented at least 37 federal violations so far." Her composure completely shattered. "Do you know who I am? I have connections. This neighborhood needs me." "What this neighborhood needs is justice," I said, loud enough for gathering neighbors to hear. "And as someone who spent 20 years prosecuting organized crime, I can assure you, your organization was amateur at best." As FBI agents led her away, neighbors emerged from their homes, watching in stunned silence. Alice approached, tears streaming down her face. "Is it really over?" "It's over," I confirmed. "And something better can begin." The look of relief spreading across faces that had lived in fear for years was more satisfying than any courtroom victory I'd ever experienced. Federal courtrooms have a way of diminishing even the most imposing figures. Margaret Holloway, stripped of her designer clothes and forced into standard-issue attire, looked smaller than I remembered. The 7 defendants sat in a row, the entire HOA board, now united in mutual suspicion rather than community control. The prosecution was handled by Jessica Ramirez, allowing me to sit as a witness rather than prosecutor. She began methodically establishing the pattern of racketeering that had terrorized Oak Ridge Estates for years. "The United States will prove that these defendants operated a criminal enterprise disguised as a homeowners association," she declared. "They used intimidation, fraud, and violence to extort money and compliance from their neighbors." The evidence was overwhelming. Financial audits revealed over $1.2 million in misappropriated funds across 5 years. Forensic accountants traced money flowing from HOA accounts to offshore shells and back to the defendants' personal finances. But the courtroom fell completely silent when the surveillance video played, Margaret deliberately pouring gasoline on my car, lighting the match, then crossing her arms to watch with a smirk of satisfaction. Her attorney's claims about community protection collapsed as the jury watched her clear delight in the destruction. Former residents who had been driven out returned to testify. The Patels described threatening notes with racial slurs. The Wilsons recounted how their children were systematically excluded from community events. The Johnsons explained how their business mysteriously lost clients after they questioned assessment increases. Margaret's defense strategy imploded when her co-defendants began turning against each other. Treasurer Helen Porter was the first to break, offering testimony for leniency. Margaret called it applying appropriate pressure, she testified. She kept what she called an elimination list of residents who questioned her authority. The goal was always to force them out and replace them with compliant neighbors. The bombshell came when Helen revealed Margaret's special notebook, a meticulous record of successful removals, with photographs of moving trucks and calculations of the profits generated when properties were sold under duress. Margaret's attorney attempted a desperate defense. "My client was simply enforcing community standards that everyone agreed to." "Did everyone agree to arson, Ms. Holloway?" Jessica countered. "Did they agree to harassment, intimidation, and fraud?" When I took the stand, Margaret couldn't maintain eye contact. I methodically outlined how her operation mirrored organized crime tactics I'd prosecuted for decades. The same patterns of territory control, intimidation, and financial exploitation. "In 23 years prosecuting criminal enterprises," I concluded, "I've never seen one hide so effectively behind respectability while terrorizing an entire community." Judge Eleanor Maxwell, herself a former victim of HOA overreach, delivered the verdict with unmistakable satisfaction. The court finds all defendants guilty on all counts. Her sentencing speech became infamous in legal circles. "You corrupted the very concept of community," she told Margaret. "You weaponized neighbors against each other for personal profit. You didn't just violate federal law. You violated the trust and safety of those who simply wanted a peaceful place to live." Margaret received 15 years for racketeering, with additional consecutive sentences for arson, mail fraud, and obstruction of justice. The other board members received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years. The most powerful moment came when Margaret was led away in handcuffs, finally understanding that her reign of suburban terror had ended. As she passed me, she whispered. "I should have checked who you were before burning your car." "Yes," I replied quietly. "You really should have." The courtroom erupted in applause as the defendants disappeared through the door leading to the federal detention center, a community finally united in relief rather than fear. The first neighborhood meeting after Margaret's conviction was held on my front lawn. No formal invitations, no mandatory attendance, no threats. Just neighbors gathering by choice for the first time in years. "I don't even know half of you," Alice observed, looking around at the faces. Margaret kept us so isolated from each other. That simple observation became our starting point. We introduced ourselves properly, not as addresses or assessment values, but as people with names, stories, and shared hopes for our community. The transformation was immediate and profound. The Mendez family volunteered their landscaping skills to help elderly residents maintain their yards. The Changs taught traditional cooking classes in their now unrestricted cultural garden. Children played freely between houses without fear of violation notices. We dismantled the HOA structure entirely, replacing it with a simple, voluntary community covenant based on mutual respect rather than control. The intimidating rule book, 73 pages of restrictions under Margaret's regime, was ceremoniously recycled and replaced with a single page of reasonable guidelines. The most symbolic change came when we removed the pretentious Oak Ridge Estates monument sign, Margaret's prideful marker of exclusive territory, and replaced it with a community garden where neighbors could grow food together. We planted the first seedlings exactly where Margaret used to stand to survey her domain. Recovery wasn't instant. Years of enforced suspicion had created deep wounds. Some residents still flinched when neighbors approached their property. Others hesitated before making even minor changes to their homes, the ingrained fear of retribution lingering like a ghost. Healing came through practical action. We established a restitution program using seized HOA assets, returning thousands in fraudulent fines to affected residents. Most satisfying was helping Mrs. Gonzalez recover her home. She'd been forced to sell under duress when Margaret targeted her for displaying a cultural flag. Former enemies became allies in rebuilding trust. Tom Franklin, who once reported neighbors under Margaret's orders, now coordinated a neighborhood watch program based on mutual protection rather than surveillance. Helen Porter, following her reduced sentence, sent a handwritten apology to every household. The most profound transformation was invisible, the disappearance of fear. Neighbors who had lived defensively for years gradually lowered their guards. Conversations happened spontaneously across property lines. Children formed friendships based on proximity rather than parental alliances. 1 year after Margaret's conviction, we held our first official neighborhood celebration. Looking around at laughing families sharing food across picnic tables, where unauthorized gatherings had once been punished, I realized we hadn't just removed a criminal enterprise. We'd rediscovered what community actually meant. Alice summed it up perfectly. For years, we lived next to each other. Now, we finally live with each other. What happened in Oak Ridge Estates didn't stay in Oak Ridge Estates. As news of Margaret's conviction spread, my office received calls from homeowners across the country describing identical patterns of intimidation and corruption in their communities. "It's like they're following the same playbook," one caller from Arizona explained. "Our HOA president uses the exact same tactics: selective enforcement, social isolation, mysterious property damage." The similarities were too striking to ignore. Working with the FBI's white-collar crime division, we launched a nationwide investigation that uncovered a disturbing pattern. Former associates of Margaret had established similar operations in communities across 12 states. Local news coverage of our case inspired homeowners to examine their own HOA finances. In California, residents discovered their board had embezzled over $4 million through fraudulent maintenance contracts. In Florida, an HOA president was found to be selling homes seized through manipulated foreclosures. Each case followed Margaret's methodology, with slight regional variations. Congressional hearings were convened as the scale of the problem became apparent. I testified alongside Oak Ridge residents, presenting evidence that these weren't isolated incidents, but a systematic exploitation of HOA legal structures. These organizations operate with minimal oversight, despite controlling assets worth billions, I explained to the committee. They wield quasi-governmental powers without governmental accountability. The hearings led to the Neighborhood Protection Act, establishing federal oversight of HOA finances and operations. The legislation created clear pathways for residents to challenge abusive practices without fear of retaliation. Margaret's case became required study at the FBI Academy as a textbook example of how organized crime adapts to exploit legitimate structures. Crime syndicates had moved beyond traditional territories into the perfectly legal framework of community governance. Most meaningful were the letters I received from homeowners who found the courage to challenge corrupt boards after hearing our story. A group in Seattle successfully removed their entire board after documenting similar abuses. A retirement community in Florida recovered nearly $300,000 in misappropriated funds. Each letter represented not just financial recovery, but reclaimed dignity. People who had been made to feel powerless in their own homes, finding strength in solidarity and legal action. The legislative analyst who tracked the impact of our case put it best. What happened in Oak Ridge wasn't just about one corrupt HOA. It exposed how vulnerable our communities are to organized exploitation. But it also showed that when neighbors stand together, even the most entrenched corruption can be defeated. The greatest vindication came when former HOA victims nationwide began running for local office, transforming governance from the ground up with transparency and genuine community service. Sometimes, justice arrives in unexpected ways. Margaret wanted to make an example of me. Instead, she became the cautionary tale, to listen to today's standing story up on to Store of Good Stories. Whether in courtrooms, if this story touched your heart, is always worth the fight. Don't forget to hit like, especially when you have video to spread this positive message to more flames for good. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.